Welcome back, everybody, and welcome to what is going to be the first installment of hopefully many moving forward of my ongoing Madden franchise wish list. And today we're going to be going over a complete scouting overhaul within franchise mode. And if you watched last year's video on this, it's going to be very similar to that because I do feel like it's a strong concept, but I have some changes and additions as well. And it's also going to be in 1080 as opposed to 480, which I somehow managed to do last year. But first off here, I'm going to run through some of the pros and cons of the current scouting system, and I think the biggest benefits of the current system is that it's easy, it's simple to understand, and it's quick, and that really comes as no surprise as franchise mode is largely predicated around getting you through seasons as quickly as possible, and the current scouting system does exactly that. However, some of the pros I think also factor into some of the cons of the current scouting system, with the first being that you just get way too little information. Whether you're looking at it from an individual prospect level or an overall draft class level, you're getting far too little information out of scouting. And as a big proponent of Fog of War, I'd say this is what the bad side of Fog of War looks like, because you're left almost completely blind on so many different things. You don't get enough information on prospects to get any kind of picture beyond those top 3 attributes, and then you're severely limited on scouting points, meaning that you're completely blind on a significant portion of each draft class as well. And then probably most importantly, it's just not fun. There's nothing really memorable about scouting. It's hard to get attached to prospects because they're little more than a couple of letter grades. You do get backstories on a few of them, and that does help, but that's also very limited, and you'll often see the same stories season after season. But moving on, the first goal here was to maintain the ease and quickness of week-to-week scouting. That's a big plus of the current system, and less time spent scouting means more time playing games or just doing other things. It's also important to keep it as a week-to-week task so that you don't completely bog down the off-season by forcing users to do it all at once. The next goal is to provide more well-rounded reports and or pictures of prospects with varying levels of influenceable Fog of War. As I just mentioned, I feel like what is currently in place is the bad side of Fog of War, and I want to expand upon that, and in expanding upon that, also make it something that the user has the power to influence, which is something I'll get into here shortly. And then the last goal is to create a roster management type meta to scouting to make it more interesting during the season, more useful leading up to and during the draft, and also creating an additional task for a fairly barren off season. And those last 2 goals is what we're going to look at first, as we start with regional scouts, and this would be part of your staff and would dictate and influence the stream of information that you receive when it came to scouting. You'd have a West, Midwest, South, and Northeast scout, and each of them would be responsible for scouting the players within their respective regions. Along with that, these scouts would have a number of skills or traits that would influence the information that you receive from each. These skills or traits would be evaluation ability, reputation, specialty, and then bias or influencers. Starting with evaluation ability, that's pretty straightforward, but one change I made here was that last year when I went over this, each scout had their own evaluation ability for each position, and while that is definitely deeper, it also carries the potential to make things more complicated and more cumbersome, and I don't think it's entirely necessary here either. So this time around, I decided to go with one all-encompassing rating, and each scout would have a rating that is either poor, below average, average, great, or elite, and each of those ratings is going to influence the accuracy of the information that you're receiving. And again, pretty straightforward here. An elite scout's information is going to skew towards being more accurate, while a scout with a poor rating is going to provide information that varies quite a bit more in terms of accuracy. Next up is reputation, which would have a similar scale of poor, good, great, and elite. And this would act kind of like an overall rating does for players, where it doesn't really mean anything outside of how scouts are paid and coveted by other teams. Scouts with an elite reputation will garner more money and more offers, while scouts with poor reputations will be just the opposite. You could also use this like a dev trait as well, where a scout with a great or elite reputation would be more likely to progress and have his evaluation ability go up, while a poor scout would be more likely to stay the same or even regress. Then following that is specialty, and this is where you can really start to give certain scouts a unique personality and character, because this can range anywhere from one specific position to a position group or even an entire side of the ball. And there's a number of different ways you could apply this as well. You could follow the current model and have players scouted at those positions get scouted faster. You could also increase the level of accuracy for the information that you receive for those positions as well. Another thing here is you could also tie retired players into this in a fun way, similar to how how the older Maddens would have retired players come back and become coaches, you could have retired players become available in the scouting staff pool with a specialty that follows the position they played, which is something that I personally think would be cool to have. And then lastly here we have bias and or influencers, and again here this would aim to give scouts a kind of unique personality separating them from other scouts, and this is another trait that would influence the information that you receive. You could have a number of different biases and influencers, but I settled on 4, which are athleticism, intangibles, potential, and talent. And how these would work is that based on these influencers, players would be scouted and graded differently. For example, a scout with a bias towards athleticism would grade players that are faster and stronger and better athletes higher than normal, and players that have below average physical attributes would be graded lower than normal. And this is something that would also allow users to tailor their scouting to their preferred style of player. If you like athletic freaks, stack your scouting staff with scouts that have a bias towards athleticism. If you're rebuilding and are looking for players with high ceilings, hire some scouts with a potential bias. It's not only something that can help you find more players that you like and want, but also throws more variables into the mix to make scouting and drafting more interesting and more thought-provoking as well. And then the last thing with this, the question is always going to be what's preventing you from just signing the best scouts, effectively destroying the entire system that's put in place. And the idea here would be to handle it similar to how the roster is handled. You guys have probably seen these X amount of dollars challenge games on Twitter or Instagram, where each level of player is given a specific dollar amount and you have to make a team with a limited amount of money, and the same idea would be used here. So just using this as an example, let's say you have a $2 million cap and you have to have 4 regional scouts. There isn't any possible way that you're going to be able to afford 4 elite scouts, and you're going to have to give and take somewhere. And this is where that roster management type meta comes into play. Each offseason, scouts are progressing, regressing, being fired, being promoted, and similar to how you would with your roster, you're trying to maintain and develop a strong scouting department. But moving along here, we're going to take a look at a mocked up version of the scouting screen, which is going to look very similar to what is currently in place, but you will notice some changes, and we're going to start here on the left side with some quality of life improvements where you get draft class information that you normally wouldn't. With how things currently stand, you don't really know anything about where a draft class's strengths or weaknesses lie until after you're done scouting, and even then you're still not really getting a good idea on most positions. This is information that every team would know, and it's something that can heavily dictate how you approach things like re-signing or free agency. So here you'd get insight into how strong a class appears to be, its deepest and weakest positions, the projected #1 pick, and then the deepest and weakest regions as well. This is information that would be universal league-wide and the same for all 32 users, and again is just to give you some expectations so you can plan your roster management around the draft. If you know it's going to be a deep wide receiver class, maybe you decide to let your free agent wide receiver walk. Meanwhile, if it's a weak wide receiver draft class, you might be more hard-pressed to re-sign him, and that's something that could even factor into contract negotiations as well, as the player might have slightly more or slightly less leverage depending on the situation. Then moving to the right, like I said, it looks very familiar, but the first thing I want to point out here is the projections. Rather than having players slotted 1 through 32 in each round and unlocking true value, which is essentially their actual projection and that you only get for about 25% of the draft class, we just have a universal grade or projection system that is a bit more expanded and reminiscent of the older Maddens, where you'll see things like top 5, top 10, and ranges that can be something like 1st to 2nd or maybe even 2nd to 4th. And then to the right there, you'll see things are a bit different with a progress bar that lets you know how much a player has been scouted, and when he's targeted for a given week, you'll see who's assigned to scout him. And the overall process here would be very similar to what is currently in place, in that you'd simply be picking players each week to scout, and the following week you'd have more information on those selected players. In this example, I allotted 15 players to scout per region per week, but you could do this a number of different ways, whether it be scouts having an allotted number of hours per week or even the continued use of scouting points. But to show you exactly how scouting would work, we have to first take a look at the new prospect scouting report. So this is what a base scouting report would look like, meaning that this is what each prospect would look like when scouting first started. So first off, we're going to start over on the right side here with the prospect profile, and this is a basic overview of the prospect where you get a player grade and projection, a player comparison that gives you an idea of what kind of real life player the prospect most resembles, a short-term and long-term projection that possibly gives you a little insight into his dev trait, a current roster projection that gives you a little hint at his overall and where he fits on your current roster if drafted, and then at the bottom, a draft ceiling and draft floor that gives you a high and low expectation of where that player could be drafted. And then moving to the scouting report itself, this is where your scout's eval ability really comes into play, because each week that you scout a player, you're going to be getting 1 or 2 lines about that player's attributes or traits until they're fully scouted. So just to use something like catching traffic for a receiver as an example here, the statements that you'll get will classify an attribute or trait from elite down to bad, and basically each of those buckets would contain a ton of quick statements about a given trait or attribute, and your scout's eval ability will dictate the range in which the statement that you receive can be chosen from. For example here, we're going to say that this statement is deemed the perfect description for a prospect's catch and traffic rating. If you have a scout with elite evaluation, the chances of you getting that perfect description or a very similar statement will be a lot higher, while the possibility of getting a description that's inaccurate will be a lot smaller. Whereas say if you have a scout with poor evaluation, the chances of getting that perfect description will still be there, but the range of inaccuracy is going to be significantly higher, not to the point to where a player that is obviously terrible at something is going to come back with an elite description or vice versa, but enough to definitely make things a bit more uncertain. Each time you scout a player, it's going to progress him around 20 to 30% towards a full scouting report, and with each player starting with a couple of bullet points already, you're never going to be going into a draft completely blind on any players. You won't exactly have a ton to go off of on the players that you didn't scout, but you'll at least have something more than just a combine grade, and the goal here is for the user to have a decent report on the majority of prospects in the draft. And speaking of combine grade, we're going to be moving on to the next tab for prospects, which is physical. And again here, this is what a prospect would look like when scouting first started, and on the left there you'll see the SPARK score, and this is something I've gone over many times before, but SPARK is an acronym for speed, power, agility, reaction, and quickness, and is a rating that attempts to quantify somebody's athleticism. One of my biggest issues with scouting currently is that you have absolutely zero knowledge of a player's athletic ability until right before the draft. You could be looking at running backs all season long and scouting guys that have a 4.6 or slower 40, and basically wasting scouting points on guys that you know you would never even consider drafting. So having something like this that hints at a player's athletic ability gives you a chance to lock in on certain types of players or avoid certain types of players as well. Then to the right of that, we have the NFL Combine, which would be the first look at actual hard data for a player's physical ability, and just like you would now, you'd get a player's numbers for each combine event. This would also be realistic to the real NFL Combine, so there would be about 330 prospects with combine data and another 120 or so without it. And that leads me to the far right, where there would also be collegiate pro days, and these would function very similar to the combine in that you'd be getting numbers for things like the 40-yard dash and other combine drills to either go along with the combine data or essentially replace it in the case of those players that weren't invited to the combine. So for a lot of players, it creates the potential for a lot of interesting situations where maybe you have a player with two very similar sets of data, so you can pretty much take it at face value, or maybe you have a player that has a data with some discrepancies in something like speed, where a player ran faster at the combine or his pro day, and there's a little bit of mystery around what you're actually getting. Then on top of that, you can have situations where a player maybe just has a SPARK score to go off of because they were injured and missed both, or maybe a player only has one set of data to go off of, whether it be because they weren't invited to the combine or decided to skip their pro day. Next up here is the medical tab, and this is fairly straightforward, but is also very wishlisty, as much of what you see here would mean absolutely nothing unless the current injury system was seriously tweaked and improved upon as well. But the main gist is that each player would have a medical evaluation that detailed their incoming health and injury risk. Health should definitely be something that you have to worry about within franchise mode, and injury-prone players should be less valued and come with more risk when drafting. But again here, this would take some serious tweaks to how injuries are handled, and I'm not sure that's something that will ever happen. Then moving on, the next tab we have is the college tab, and this would essentially give you somewhat of a backstory on the player. It would show you their college stats as well as any awards or accolades, and while something like this is largely window dressing, you can definitely use it not to just give players a bit of personality and uniqueness, but to give some insight into what a player's career arc might be trending towards. Maybe you have a guy like Mark Sanchez or Mitchell Trubisky that only really started for one season in college, or maybe a guy like Joe Burrow who has this sudden explosion in his final college season. It's not something that just has to be window dressing. It's something that can definitely have a purpose and some meaning behind it. And then lastly here we we have the Stories tab, and this would essentially be another quality of life edition. Stories are something that I believe desperately need to be expanded upon because it's definitely a great feature, but when every season you get a guy going from being the Karate Kid or a weightlifter to a college football player and a defensive player winning the Heisman, it really kind of kills it. But this tab would basically be used to collect and consolidate any tweets or stories related to that player and keep them all in one place so that if you do miss one or you just aren't paying attention, you can still get insight into whether or not there was any big happenings with that player during the year. But I think that's going to just about do it. Obviously, this is very similar to the last time I covered this, but like I said at the beginning, I do feel like this is a pretty solid concept with a lot of room to be taken even further. Let me know what you guys think, what you might change, and whether or not this is something that you would like to see in Madden and in franchise mode in the future. I appreciate your guys' time. Hope you have a great rest of your day, and as always, thanks for watching.